Hi, welcome to class today. I'm Elaine Engelhardt from Utah Valley State, and the class is Ethics and Values. Today we're moving on into what's known as a relationship ethic. It's an emerging ethic with not much material written on it, and I've invited a special guest to be with us here to discuss it. It's Dr. Sharon Bienvenue, and welcome, Sharon.
Thank you.
It's terrific to have you here with us.
My pleasure.
And I'm going to introduce the students, and then I'll come back and have you tell us a little bit about your background.
Thank you.
Okay, over here we have Rhonda and Luke. And on this side, Aaron and Lloyd. So thanks for joining us in this discussion. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Sharon.
Well, I have been interested in this kind of work since I started on my PhD in 06, I think. I always thought that that it was all my problem and that I was different, and then I found out actually with this particular work that women did speak in a different voice, and this was actually, I brought the book. This was my book from my PhD program, and it was in the first course that I took. Went on to become Professor Emerita from Emory University in Atlanta, was there 20 years. And built the communication program there in the business school. I now teach in an international MBA program in Helsinki and continue to do consulting and training. And my passion is gender differences in workplace communication, and that no one's options should be limited based on their gender.
Thank you. And it's so nice to have you here with us today, giving us your insights into this author and how important some of these insights are. Carol Gilligan came to campus at Utah Valley State several years ago, and it was a wonderful experience for all of us. And when she spoke, she had updated her talk. And in a different voice, I've got the same book, came out in 1982, and she entitled her talk In a Different Voice 16 years later. And she redefined the word different, and she said, actually, different means women being added to the conversation creates a different conversation. And her whole enterprise in doing this was in saying women have been left out of the conversation. They've been left out of the studies. They have been non-existent. And in fact, in many of the studies done by Freud, Erikson, Piaget, Kohlberg, we were looking at kind of the superior white male child and their point of view. So we didn't even have, some of the other classes, so to speak. And so Gilligan challenges hard a very strong destiny, a very strong, I meant to say, dynasty in moral psychology. And she's going to add her work to it now. Was it pretty controversial when it came out for you, or was it quite well accepted?
It was, for me, controversial because it was different from anything that I had known about in the past, and I thought that, I lived in some kind of isolation in terms of how I communicated and my particular voice. I remember that all of the work at that time that we were reading was so interesting, but we talked about Freud and Erikson and Kohlberg, and then that Gilligan came along and said that it was really not good psychology if you were leaving out half of the human race.
A real problem there.
Yes, and it meant that suddenly that we started looking at the fact that so much of the research had excluded women, and when you were making decisions about how people were going to become mature and moral and ethical, that you couldn't do it based on half of the human race.
And when she was here, she basically said that, and she added a little more to it. At the time, she was at Harvard University, as was Lawrence Kohlberg, and he was, of course, tenured, a full tenured professor, and she was on tenure track. She had children, she had a husband who's a physician, she enjoyed her garden, but she really enjoyed looking at the hole that was left by not having women's voices included in the moral psychology research. And so she makes these big, broad statements, and in some respects discredits Kohlberg's moral theory, his 6 moral stages of theory. And by doing so, it's strong enough that she's given tenure quite quickly. It was quite a battle for tenure because she and Kohlberg were friends, and then they weren't friends, and then they were friends again. But it was also, I think, such a trying time for Lawrence Kohlberg that he eventually just walked into the ocean one day. And,
Oh, wow.
yeah, and so these are, it was a very hard and trying time in moral psychology. And
Well, she is still getting, receiving some criticism.
she does.
But I find this so interesting because she is being criticized by people who said that everything was black and white and right and wrong. And she came along and said, I think there's just another way of looking at this. And those people who do all of their research with black and white and right and wrong heard her say, what you're doing is wrong. And she wasn't even saying that. She was saying there is gray area, there is another option. And that makes it so much more powerful to me.
I think another area of criticism, I like that, because I think that's what she would agree with. Another area of criticism is folks saying that she essentializes women and men, that she puts women in this category and men in this category, and she really tries to defend that she does not do that.
I don't hear that. I hear her talking about in trying to find people who do not exemplify stereotypes, and I see, although my brain applies a theory as soon as, I'm into the application part. The theory is always a struggle for me. But I see this being so appropriate for where we are today, where women are going into roles, jobs that were traditionally male, and men are going into many jobs that were traditionally female. And so all of the stereotypical roles are merging. And we recognize that then the skills that the women bring and the men bring are both necessary. And this just, as you said, offers another texture, offers another voice.
Okay, I really like that. And let's see what the students also have to say about this. Any comments from Luke or Rhonda on Carol Gilligan's theory?
Yeah, I think that Carol Gilligan has brought a lot of different ideas forth so that it's allowed women to move, into other areas. It wasn't just the women's movement, but it's been a lot of other people like Carol Gilligan who has done those kinds of things. For instance, in the early 70s, I was in high school, and I didn't get to play basketball until my senior year. and only then was it beginning to have other thoughts, that we do things differently, or that we like similar things.
Good comment. Luke, nothing from you then?
I think it's interesting for me as a male to read this and kind of get a different perspective. And it's interesting to think that, in many ways her argument is saying that we've had a sort of a male perspective on ethics and on philosophy for a very long time. And she brings a perspective that is definitely different from, Kant or Aristotle or any of the people we've spoken about so far.
Does that offend you in any way?
No.
Sometimes when we read something is it okay for me to ask a question?
Absolutely.
Sometimes when we read something that is completely different, then at first read it can be offensive or frightening. You don't look like you scare easily, but
No, I do actually, but not on this one.
He's well integrated into the feminist system. Lloyd, a comment?
Yeah, I was going to say, when I first read Carol Gilligan, I didn't like what she had, because I thought she was pushing a sort of gender essentialism. But as I read it more, I've come to realize that she's not saying that men are this way and women are this way, but more that just like traditionally we've had roles that men have had. Traditionally men have been put in the workplace and women have been kept in the home, but that doesn't have to be the case. And similarly, traditionally men have been not forced, but have been trained to think in this certain way, and women have been trained to think in this certain way to fit those roles. And it's that other perspective that's been ignored for so long. Doesn't mean that only women have that, but it's just that's what traditionally women have been raised with, that different viewpoint, which has been largely ignored in our society.
Oh, I like that. I like that point a lot. And how about you,
I just
Erin?
stole everything. I don't know.
No, it's because I'm
Read your
awesome.
mind and took it out.
No, it's just a chicken and egg problem. You know, it becomes, you know, it is this mesh with Carol Gilligan between the ethics and the philosophy and the moral psychology that Dr. Bienvenu was talking about. But is it something where, as Lloyd was saying, that we've been taught and trained in these gender roles that men should be more autonomous in their ethic, or that women should be more relationship driven, or are we just? And I think Carol Gilligan starts to ask that question in some very interesting ways when she talks about play with small children, and when she talks about those things as a recent parent, that becomes even more interesting to you.
It is.
May I make a point about
Oh,
this?
please
You
do.
said with roles. If we look at all of the gender literature, we see that men traditionally, generations and generations, have been afforded attention-getting roles, and women have been afforded attention-giving roles. And so, you know, you have generations and generations of that socialization, and it is difficult then to work against that, and you're also working against the expectations. So if you have a woman who does not give attention, or a man, then we're disconcerted, and if we have a man who does give that attention, it seems different to us.
May I comment on
Sure.
what you're saying?
Thanks, Rhonda.
I find it interesting as a single. I'm a single woman in her later midlife.
Oh, no. Early midlife.
That to be invited out to join several couples, that doesn't happen. However, or even invited over for dinner, you know, with a family, but men will be. And, you know, and that still happens. You know, it's all the poor single man on whatever day he can't cook or he can't do for himself. Therefore, will invite the man over for dinner, but they don't ever think of the woman being invited over for dinner.
Because women are supposed to be already so well connected with relationships.
Oh, exactly. And
Yes.
those roles still exist today.
And one of the places where Carol Gilligan goes that ties right in with what these comments have been moving toward, and you'll notice this as we look at the graphics, she's saying, in the world of men, they are taught to be autonomous and separate from mother as soon as possible, and the mark of maturity is autonomy. But for women, that isn't a mark of maturity. In fact, some of the hardest work is keeping relationships together. And especially when some guy is taught he's supposed to be autonomous. You want to add to that, Erin?
Elaine, that reminds me of this conversation my husband and I were having about being in the supermarket and standing in the checkout line. And you look at the men's, like, there are only a few men's magazines anyway, right? But Men's Health or something like that, there's nothing like there is on the front of a numerous amount of women's magazines saying how to keep this relationship, how to spoil your spouse, how to do any number of things in your relationships. Like, it's always your responsibility. And that still, to some extent, and I think to a large extent, is still seen as a feminine or a female responsibility to keep a relationship.
I think that's a good insight, and it's not, in the literature before it was not seen as a mark of maturity. I think now the research is taking it that way, that it's saying very much it's a mark of maturity for both men and women. And a great place to go, but you've noticed the magazine covers aren't really taking it there.
It's a random one, but
When we look at research being done on what organizations want in new hires, 6 or 7 out of 10 of the skills that they are looking for are communication-based. And many of those have to do with listening and problem solving and interviewing and motivating and persuading, all of which are relationship things. They're still being ignored many times in business schools. teaching those kinds of things. But it shows the importance of relationships over just the, black and white decision-making processes.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more on that. And there's one other place I'd like to go before we start pulling up the graphics. But Erin mentioned that children's play was brought up in the book in a different voice. And we don't have that section in our book about how little boys and little girls play differently. But it was quite fundamental to her research. And do you want to tell us a little bit about that, Erin?
I can try. It's interesting. What she did is in observations of groups of children playing, little girls often played at relationships, and games with set rules, they would often change it or tweak it or bend it or make it work so that everyone could play, or so that everyone would continue to play. Whereas often the little boys who were playing were very strict with the application of the rules, either rules of the game or rules they created for a game. And that was something else that she observed, that boys would create rules for the game that they were playing, whereas little girls may not.
Sure, and it might be something like little girls playing some game, and an argument comes up. They just as soon quit playing the game as to get into an argument with each other, because it really can cause some permanent damage in their relationships, and they don't want that. Now, little boys, let's say they're playing baseball, so they're spread a long ways away from each other. They don't even want to talk to each other. And it's almost as fun for maybe some of the less talented athletes, or maybe the better talented athletes too, to argue about the rules. It's as much fun to argue about the rules as it is to play the game. And so we also see a variation there in child's play. And once again, not meaning to be essentialist, I think it's very good for young women to play these rule-bound games and to understand that when they get into the male corporate world, that this competition is going to be there, and they're going to need to do this. Lloyd, you're laughing.
All this discussion, this is anecdotal, reminded me of a girls dating, and we were going to play some game, and just before we started, she said, well, let's not keep score.
Yeah.
And
What's the point?
so I broke up with her, but.
We find that men are motivated by competition. They think it's fun, which is why men will have a meeting and in workplace and fight and carry on, and then they'll be just vicious, and then they will leave and go play golf. And if women so much as raise their voices in a meeting and disagree about anything, they wouldn't possibly go out afterwards and do something social, because they have to go heal from that. And so we continue with that behavior.
We do, and not to essentialize, but these things happen. I was recently at a family reunion, and the dads wanted to see the two nieces run against each other. They wanted a race, and they got them right at the starting line, and the one niece looked at the other and she goes, let's tie.
Perfect.
It is, and this is what I think Freud was alluding to as the dark continent of human thought. So let's go ahead and pull up this first quote, and it's right in your book on page 55, the first paragraph there. And could I get you to read that for us, Luke?
Yes. The rightness or wrongness of an act is not a contest of rights, but a problem of relationships, centering upon a question of responsibility which, in the end, must be faced.
Okay, so we're moving right here into the notion that it's not the rightness or wrongness of an act, but it is a problem within a relationship. Is someone damaged? Are they hurt? And let's read the next slide, which is going to tell us a little bit about the morality that fits into this. And would you read that, Rhonda?
Sure. Morality is based upon relationships. A moral problem is a problem of care and responsibility in relationships, not a problem of rights and rules.
Okay, and once again, we're going to see that these notions of rights and rules may be attached more to an ethic that we'd find with Kant or Hobbes or perhaps even Mill. Gilligan's not going to throw these out, but she's going to say, you guys forgot to look at relationships. Want to add anything to that, Sharon?
I just think it's so very important because women are more likely to think of everyone else who is involved in, and anyone should, that the idea of the relationship piece when you make a decision, the responsibility that you have, the consequences are not just for yourself, but for so many people down the line, which I think we'll talk about soon with the Heinz dilemma.
Okay. And also, in looking at this ethic, we'll notice that in our lives, our relationships are very important. And Luke, let me just ask you, if you had to have this dreadful thing happen to you, would you rather be betrayed by your wife or kicked in the shins?
I think I'd take kicked in the shins.
Okay.
Yeah.
And tell me a little bit about why that's your response.
I think I'd get over kicked in the shins a lot quicker.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And what happens when you're betrayed by your wife?
You know, there's a relationship there that is, you know, one of trust, and if that, you know, is damaged, then that's going to be a lot more painful and take a lot more time to deal with or overcome.
It's going to hurt deeply.
Yeah.
And so if one of our definitions of ethics is that we're not to harm others, we find one of the toughest harms we can do to someone else is through relationships, betrayal, lying, different things like that. And so once again, besides explaining to us some of the ways that women have been left out of the area of moral psychology, Gilligan's also talking to us about these notions of harm that happen within relationships. So, and now this is the quote that I was actually thinking we were starting with. So Erin, would you read this one for us?
Sure. In 1914, with his essay on narcissism, Freud swallows his distaste at the thought of abandoning observation for barren theoretical controversy and extends his map of the psychological domain. Tracing the development of the capacity to love, which he equates with maturity and psychic health, he locates its origins in the contrast between love for the mother and love for the self.
Ooh, very interesting. And let's move on to the next one then.
But in thus dividing the world of love into narcissism and object relationships, he finds that while men's development becomes clear, women's becomes increasingly opaque. This difficulty in fitting the logic of his theory to women's experience leads him in the end to set women apart, marking their relationships, like their sexual life, as a dark continent for philosophy.
Okay, and with this coming out by Gilligan, we see many others who start looking at Freud and saying, you really have left out half of the population. You've decided that because women are the dark continent of human thought, we'll just kind of see them as an anomaly and we'll do our studies with men. Want to add anything to that, Dr. Bienvenu?
No, it just scares me and makes me crazy that that I believe that, you know, that there's still some people who think of women as the dark continent of philosophy, and that and will go back to that because they are comfortable with it, and there are people, some men particularly, who might say, you know, would like to say, I couldn't possibly understand my wife because she's the dark continent of philosophy. You know?
I'm going to label her the dark continent of human understanding.
Right, then I don't have to ever deal with that again because Freud said it was okay. You know, it's like, no, move on.
Erin, you're laughing about this. Anything you want to add to that?
Rhonda and I were talking about this, and we were thinking it was very odd that Freud had studied almost entirely women. I mean, his major works are about women. But that's the way you have to say it. They're about women, not actually that woman. It's not a study of Dora. It's about Dora in relationship to all the men around her. And so it's interesting how Freud studies only women and then abstracts that for men. And that so much of psychology and philosophy and a number of things have been taken from these studies of Freud, and yet his entire work's based on this abstraction. And I just think it's funny too and scary at the same time.
Yes. Thank you. I'm glad I'm not the only one scared. Okay.
Other thoughts from any of you?
Well, she mentioned Dora, and it's funny when you read Dora. The whole time I read, I was thinking, this poor girl, because here she is. Freud's supposedly studying her, but everything she says, everything she does, Freud basically says, "Well, we can't understand her. She doesn't know. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Let's see what her dad says. Let's see what this guy says. Let's see what I say." It's always, well, the guys know more about Dora than Dora knows about herself.
And as the reading continues on, that's the perfect point, because Gilligan says, then we have other moral psychologists who follow in Freud's path, and they continue to say, well, this is how moral development moves according to these observers of women. And then it just became easier to just observe the men, because the women didn't make much sense. And so now Gilligan's going to take on her Harvard contemporary, and she's going to say, this study that you did on the 6 stages of moral development using Heinz' dilemma is very flawed. And let's look at Heinz' dilemma, what it is. And Lloyd, would you read this for us?
Sure. A man named Heinz must obtain a very expensive drug for his wife. Without the medication, his wife will die. The druggist informs Heinz that the needed medication will cost $2,000. Heinz explains that he has only $1,000 and asks the druggist to sell their needed drug to him at a reduced cost. The druggist refuses, indicating the cost is and will remain $2,000. Should Heinz steal the drug?
This is a prompt that Kohlberg's researchers give to children. And they're going to ask the boys how they respond to this, and then they're going to ask girls how they respond to this. And then Carol Gilligan is going to replicate this same study. But Rhonda, let me just ask you what you think about this case, and is this an easy response for you? And of course, they come right out and say, so should Heinz steal the drug?
No. Heinz should not steal the drug. There's other ways that he could go about either raising the money, getting a loan, doing something else in order to achieve the goal that he needs. And
as the young women try to explain this notion to Kohlberg's researchers, they find that the researchers think they're stupid. I shouldn't say stupid, but they cannot reach the same levels of moral understanding that the young men do. And as the young men are looking at this, Lloyd, what are some of the young men's reasoning behind why Heinz should steal the drug?
Well, they reason, they try, well, I don't say what their reasoning is, but that they are trying to do a lot of reasoning is what the report shows, and that they're arguing, okay, well, they don't have enough money, but it's their duty to take care of the person's life, and that this person's evil, so they have all these layers of reasons that justify why they should or shouldn't steal the drugs.
Okay, and even start moving into the social order, saying a judge is even going to agree with me on this. If Heinz gets caught and has to go before a judge is going to say it's more important for Heinz's wife to live than for this druggist to have to keep a hold of his drug and not give it out. Rhonda, your thoughts on it, and then Aaron.
But that's not to say that the girls aren't reasoning. They just reason a different way.
They are. Tell us a little bit about that too, Aaron.
I just think that part of the problem is, and I think Dr. Bienvenu has alluded to this as well as you, Elaine, in that they didn't have the language. The young men or the boys were using terms and definitions that already exist in moral psychology and philosophy and these things, and have a long history of being used. The concept of the greater good is that the wife be saved rather than the money be retained by the druggist, or something like that. Whereas the young women or the girls were trying to explain something that doesn't have a history, that isn't privy to the whole of the discussion.
Doesn't have those catchwords.
Exactly, and so they don't look as intelligent to Kohlberg or Kohlberg's research assistant or whatever when they're trying to explain their solution to the problem.
And what I see is that Kohlberg is measuring confidence And so he sees these boys go, yes, no, no jury will convict me. Of course she should live, black, white, yes, no, right, wrong. And the girls are saying, should he steal the drug? Well, does that mean should he bargain for the drug? Should he pay less for the drug? And by adding that question, which as we look at the women's literature, women tend to question things anyway, and often it's perceived as women asking questions because they have no clue of the answer, but they're asking questions in order to get that out on the table. So it doesn't fit, and therefore it is wrong or substandard or stupid.
And she's not answering the prompt they're giving. For her, it's not an either or. It's not, so should Heinz steal the drug or let his wife die? That's not what it's about at all for these young women. For them, it's that we have a very important relationship here, Heinz's wife, and she could die. And we'd like to make sure she gets the drug. And stealing for her is only going to mess up things even more. And so she says, you know, there are all kinds of ways that you can come up with the drug. When someone tells you, no, you can't do this, there's a rule that says you can't, Sharon, do you believe it?
Oh, just as much as you do, Elaine. You know, as you do, we squint our eyes and say, watch me.
And if someone says, no, you can't come up with $200 to save your wife, Heinz, how are you going to respond to this, Rhonda?
Watch me.
You'll do bake sales. You might talk to Heinz's wife and blackmail her. There are a lot of different ways where women may perhaps go around this set of rules. And Jake in here then has a very definite set of rules. And Amy's saying, you don't have to do that. There are better ways to do this. You know, it's not like you have to end up stealing something and going to a judge. We can use our network of relationships and do this in a much more mature way. And instead, they're saying, she can't answer a question. So, and she's graded very low on Kohlberg's
Well, I just wanted to mention that Amy is looking down the road. You know, say Heinz steals the drug. Well, then what might happen to Heinz? You know, if he's not there to take care of his wife after he gets the medication because he's been hauled off to jail.
What's the next step?
Then what will she do?
Right. And so very concerned about relationships. Let's look at our next two graphics and see then where this ties in with our dilemma. And Luke, could you read this for us?
Jake and Amy give differing responses. Amy's judgments contain the insights central to an ethic of care, just as Jake's judgments reflect the logic of the justice approach.
Okay, so in here then we're not trying to essentialize. We're trying, in fact, either gender could come up with this approach to Heinz's dilemma. But Amy is really looking at the relationships that are involved in this, that other relationships will come in and help out, that Heinz's relationship with his wife is very important, and that there is a strong network of community that will absolutely help in a crisis like this. And we see that when someone is needing a liver perhaps, and there's a cup on the supermarket counter and you can donate money into it. But there are ways where we really want to see, as a community, people get the best possible outcome that they can. And certainly, I think a lot of maturity goes to Jake in this too. He really does have a good logical approach, but I don't think we can take anything away from Amy. How about this, Lloyd? Anything you'd like to add? And
just going back to what we talked about a lot way earlier about this competitive nature and whatnot, it just reminded me of another experience I had where me and my friends were playing some games, and my buddy's girlfriend was playing as well, but she didn't like that we were being so competitive, so she wants to go, well, let's play a game where we're all winners. And so after that, every time we play a game with her, we always joke on, oh, yay, we're all winners, hooray. But for us guys, it's like, well, there's supposed to be a winner, there's supposed to be a loser in the game. Everything is supposed to have a winner and a loser. There's supposed to be a right and a wrong. And in a sense, there's a different approach to things.
What a boy you are.
Yeah, where there's this, well, everyone can be a winner kind of approach. Everyone can come out on the best end, where for a lot of guys, just because we've been raised with this competitive nature, that doesn't make sense a lot of times.
And it's showing a lot of strength in the corporate culture.
It is, in fact, one of the just life-changing books in the study of negotiation was the book Getting to Yes, which talked about a win-win situation. And it's the problem, however, with that book is that if both people don't read it and agree to it, then you've got one person who thinks everybody can win and the other person, going, yeah, sure. So it's still controversial and difficult unless you agree from the beginning that you are going to collaborate rather than compete, collaborate rather than compromise, which sounds like losing. And it's a tough application all the way around.
And Rosa Beth Moss Cantor wrote a seminal work where she was talking about men and women of the corporation, and she said the corporation is going this way of logic and right and wrong, black white, and she said and women are trying their best to fit within this corporate culture and understand what's going on here, but she says it's something within, it's not biological within the women. It's something where if this is the culture they have to exist in, they can. But the newest books coming out, and Rosa Beth Moss Cantor has written books since then saying having these good, strong relationships makes for a much better working situation. Erin.
I was going to say, I think we do have to point out that and guard against the essentialism and that it's not biological, because I grew up in a family of all girls and we have no problem being competitive, none at all. But we also do that within a certain confine, Monopoly, or well, not usually Monopoly because it's too long, we all give up. But that's not the point. The point is that within the culture we're taught the certain ways to react or to not react, and what relationships are more important or are not important, and which ways we should go with that discussion. My mother, who's an HR director, has often commented on the fact that it's not that she needs to be more like these men, but that they need to be more like other people, herself included, who are capable of maintaining relationships and being logical within the corporation. And that an ethics, and I interpret that as an ethics of care and an ethics of justice, which I think is a better way to put it, and that's how Gilligan uses it, are both deficient when they're alone.
Okay, in fact, let's pull up the next quote on that. And would you read that for us, Rhonda?
Rights ethic or justice ethic is based upon equality and reciprocity, while a care ethic is based upon understanding responsibility, which is equity and relationships.
Okay, so we're going to move on in then to this notion that you were talking about, Erin. Do you want to put this in your own words?
I think that it's important that Gilligan points out that an ethics of care is based on, or is using things that are part of an ethics of justice, but they're putting those in the prime spot, whereas an ethics of justice often puts them lower, like in the Kohlberg scale. And so what she's pointing out here is that it is a twist on the perspective, but that both are incorporated.
Moving toward just an interdisciplinary focus on what you've just said, one of my favorite books is by Leo Tolstoy called The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And if you'll indulge me for just a moment, in this book it starts out saying he died the most horrible of all deaths because he never loved. And then and the people who are coming to the funeral don't want to really be there, they're just there because it's a social obligation. And we go back and we start looking at his life, and his life was lived as a social obligation. He goes to college, he graduates from law school, he becomes a lawyer, he gets married. All these things are out of social obligation. He doesn't ever really love his wife. They have children. Some of them die. It hurts too much to even have a personal relationship with his wife or children. Then he gets a wonderful promotion and he's made a judge. And he's already an attorney, and he has been so proud of his ability to be dispassionate, not get involved with other individuals, and to look like he's the pillar of society. In fact, as Tolstoy tells us, he has decorated his home so that it looks like everyone else has decorated their home who would like to appear to be wealthy. And he thinks his wife's going to be so happy with this. The tough thing is that he doesn't know this family, and he suddenly finds himself very sick. It was part of his redecorating efforts, and he injures himself. And now he wants people to come give him sympathy. He doesn't want his physician to be dispassionate. He wants a relationship with the physician, but the physician is going to just treat him like just another name, another number, and that's it. He wants his wife and children to be giving him more attention, but they're not. In fact, the one person who does give him the attention is his servant Gershom, who says there's no more important time than birth and death, and of course marriage too, he adds in there. And I will stay here with you as you die. And at one point we have Ivan Ilyich talking to death, and he says, I want to live, and death says, why? And he says, I want to live so I can love. And he realizes that he left this aspect out of his life. And I think this is an important part of Gilligan's book, because she says that when her book was written in '82, she was talking about maybe a different generation of men and women. But she said, somewhere around age 40, women really do get tired of being in the home, and they're going to move out and go for a career. But men suddenly have this awakening that relationships are so very important, and they want to come back in and say, oh, let's do a whole lot of family stuff together, and let's get these relationships going. And you just have these stars crossing paths. Some thoughts on that, Sharon?
I was just thinking about the fact that often women's careers peak at a later time than men. They will often say that women's careers will peak in their 50s and men's careers peak in their 40s. And it's because women take that time to start the family and build the home fires and so forth, and then when everything's under control, then they will start focusing on the other things that they want to do. They go back to school, they go back to work, and then just about the time that the men get all tired and want to stay home and be cozy, the women are like, whew. So it does create some issues. That is better, however, than the women who have revolved their entire lives around their children and family, and then the men continue working and the children leave and the women have nothing to do. And so I think at least I would choose the first option of being a little different in sync than have no sync at all.
Good
My
point.
choice.
Yeah, good point. Anyone
Bias.
else want to add to this notion and the importance of having love and relationships in your life rather than just ruling with dispassion, so to speak? Aaron, Aaron's got.
I guess I just also have something to say. I don't know. I feel kind of bad. No, I was going to say again. I think the interesting thing is that an ethics of justice left on its own, like Ivan Ilyich, is dispassionate, autonomous, removed, and leaves us lacking. Whereas an ethics of care, and I think it's Marilyn Friedman who comes along after Gilligan and talks about how we need to have an ethics of justice incorporated into our personal relationships with the ethics of care. Because if something goes wrong in an ethics of care, then what do you do? And she talks about how justice comes into play there, and that there is an overlap in our lives. That we don't spend all of our lives with just men or just women as far as gender's concerned. And we're saying that this isn't an essentialist ethics. So why would we just use one or the other? Absolutely. And in fact, I think that Gilligan would say, don't avoid any of your other systems of ethics. This is just adding a new voice to the conversation that wasn't allowed before. Excellent point you make there for us. Well, let's pull up the next graphic, and this is going to talk to us about an ethic of care and 3 stages. Luke, would you read this for us?
Yes. Phase 1, survival, focuses on caring for the self in order to ensure survival. Phase 2, goodness, focuses on understanding the connectedness between self and others. Emphasis is unequally on others. Phase 3, truth, focuses on the dynamics of relationships. Self and other are interdependent.
Okay, so she's going to basically say, we start out at this one phase where we'll do anything for the other. Women or whoever it is will forget about themselves and just, sacrifice everything for everyone else. And she's going to say, it's not a good thing. You lose yourself. You don't know who you are. Anything you'd like to add about phase 1?
Well, I know. I want to do all. I want to
do it all.
I've been so waiting for this one. This is a very exciting piece of theory for me, because it seems to talk about the fact that as a child that we are so focused on ourselves that there is this survival, and hopefully we outgrow this and we move away from being focused on only ourselves. And then we go into this phase where we are in school and we are working and we are building a family and we're doing all these things, and we do the focus on other people. We are doing what school wants us to do, and we are doing what our employer wants us to do, and we are doing what our parents want us to do, and we are doing what our spouse and our children want us to do. We go through all of that, and then at some point we reach this third phase, this truth phase, where we are able to strip away these demands that may be unrealistic or are artificial, and decide that this is the truth for us, and it brings back the real. So we're back in a way to taking care of ourselves, but by taking care of ourselves in this third part, we are truly reaching the mature ethic of care, because I have decided what is right for me as a mature adult, and that makes me a better friend and colleague to you, a better spouse for Paul, a better mother for Hillary, a better professor, because I'm past only thinking about what other people think of me or trying to please them. I have found my own truth.
And starting, in fact, it's too bad we can't start with the self in saying, yes, you must develop a relationship with yourself. And from there, you can have these other very healthy relationships. What were you thinking about that, Rhonda?
Well, I was thinking about my being here in school at the age that I am, and
good for you.
Thank you.
Yes.
But it is different than any other phase of my life in that I am having to learn how to put myself first. But I found that I'm a better student than I was back when I was 18, 19, 20. In fact, those grades that I have then are embarrassing. But I think different, I feel different, I have a different insight, and that I'm able to put those things together, which is a wonderful feeling.
And I think that's exactly where Carol Gilligan is going with this point. Any other comments?
I've got a question. When it talks about survival, is it survival for the self just as the individual, or survival for the self as a member of a relationship?
Well, the way that I've interpreted it is survival for the individual, because you just give up who you are, and it's like, I'll do anything to keep the mortgage payments coming in and the house clean and whatever it is, and you start living an illusory life, and
like
just
a child.
say,
Like just my next thought is what I absolutely need: food, care.
And the relationship consequently can become quite poor as well when someone is not exercising their true selfhood. So it's certainly something that a wife would not want from her husband, and a husband should never want this from a wife either. It would be where they would both have a very strong self.
And I wonder if that's one of the main reasons that marriages fail today, is that each person hasn't incorporated into their lives the value of themselves first before they put that value together in a couple. Just a thought.
Well, along with that, if you move that on to into the second phase of service to others,
Right.
so I'm so busy as the provider, I'm so busy because, going to work and going to church and going to do this and going to do that, that I have no idea which child is which. But I'm sure that but there's food on the table.
Exactly.
So sometimes that would also be a breakdown of a relationship when I have taken on so much responsibility for taking care of other people that I have lost what's real in my life.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Very good discussion. Let's go ahead and move on to our next point and pull up that graphic. And could you read this for us, Erin?
A moral person is one who helps others. Goodness is service, meeting one's obligations and responsibilities to others. The essence of moral decisions is the exercise of choice and the willingness to accept responsibility for that choice.
So, Erin, this might not go along very well with what Nietzsche would say, but it certainly would be fine with what some of our other philosophers have said. Any problems with this definition that she's going to give to a moral person?
It certainly moves away from the delineated, prescriptive kind of move that I think some of the other philosophers make, which is a moral person must be X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. And there's certainly some more wiggle room here, which may be because of the ethics of care situation. It may be because of time and place, because she is I don't want to use the word modern because I associate that with a certain period in philosophy, but she's from 1980. That concept. We were there. There's a difference though in how she wants us to view others as moral and ourselves as moral. And I think that often is the most difficult as to how we view ourselves as moral people.
I have a question about this,
Sure.
is that the problem I have with this definition is that I think people stop with the first line with a moral person meets obligations and responsibility to others. And so, you have lots of people going, I am moral, see me, I'm a wonderful moral person. I think the important part of this definition is the second part, which talks about choice and responsibility. And I don't think that, I don't think that that's used often enough, that people will say that they are, they will become self-righteous about being moral because they are meeting all their obligations and taking care of people.
If you don't mind, I'd like to give you a personal example. I have a youngest son who has had to spend sometimes months in and out of jail for the last couple of years because of some of the decisions that he made in his life. And I recently received a letter from him indicating to me that he said something to the effect of, Mom, I realized that because of the decisions I've made, that I'm on probation. I'm not free to leave the state right now. And I realize too that I have to make choices based on the fact that I'm on probation, and that I'm not free, to make those otherwise free choices that we make in everyday society. And so I was just looking at this thinking, the moral decisions, being morally a moral person is to freely make those decisions, and be able to live the consequences,
Yes.
whether they're bad consequences or whether they're good consequences, and that everything has a consequence to it.
Thank
very
you.
important.
And I think we'll see that line come up with our existentialist philosophers, but in tying it back to Gilligan as well, we can see you don't hide behind someone else like a child and say, well, I'm going to let my husband make that choice for me, or I'm going to let this person take responsibility for that choice. You take your own responsibility.
I was going to say that this can be abused as well, and I think there's an important distinction that has to be made, and that's there's a difference between the willingness to accept responsibility for a choice and someone enforcing a responsibility or forcing a consequence. Because sometimes I think the care ethic will not require, but a care ethic will lead someone to say, okay, well, you made a mistake, you made this choice, but you know what? Because of my relationship with you, because of my care, whatever, you don't have to deal with those consequences.
And I think that's a very good delineation that you make there, Lloyd. In fact, it kind of helps pull us into the conclusion of this episode. And let's go ahead and pull up the graphic that's called Conclusion. And could you read this one for us, Luke?
By rendering a care perspective more coherent and making its terms explicit, moral theory may facilitate women's ability to speak about their experiences and perceptions and may foster the ability of others to listen and understand.
Thank you. So giving a definition here then of the care ethic and how it can make its mark in society, and then moving on into evidence of care, what this means as part of our conclusion. And Rhonda, could you read this for us?
At the same time, the evidence of care focused in women's moral thinking suggests that the study of women's development may provide a natural history of moral development in which care is ascendant, revealing the ways in which creating and sustaining responsive connection with others becomes or remains a central moral concern. Moral theory lies in the fact that human survival may depend less on formal agreement than on human connection.
Okay, so Dr. Bienvenu, a nice way to summarize this, telling us that perhaps moral theory or an ethic of care lies in the fact that human survival may depend less on rules or formal agreement and more on human connection. A last thought for us.
My last thought is that because something is different does not mean it is wrong. And if we can keep an open mind about that, then we are more likely to build those relationships and include all of our options instead of living in a black and white world.
Thank you. And often the discussion does go back to In a Different Voice, the title of her book. And does that mean that it is worse? Well, certainly it doesn't. And I'm glad we've had such a good, robust discussion on this today and some good laughs. And I hope that you students will go ahead and start working on your business ethics section now. Thanks so much to all of you. Bye-bye.